Okay, let's get started. Whoops. Hi, I'm Christopher Coots. I'm a professor in the law school program of jurisprudence and social policy, and it's my privilege as a member of the Tanner Committee to welcome you all to day 2 of our Tanner lectures this year of the Times of Possibility with Professor Annabelle Brett. I do not want to even try to compete with my colleague, Professor Wallace's fabulous introduction of Professor Brett yesterday. I'll just say that she is Professor of Political Thought and History, and I love especially the political thought part. Well, there's not often that much thought in the political these days. So if you can profess it, we will listen. And co-director of the Cambridge Center for Political Thought, who will bring us up to speed with on day 2 on opening the space for possibility in legal systems. And with that, I'll actually, sorry, before I bring you right up here, I'll just tell you the plan for the day is that that Professor Brett will give her second lecture. We'll then have a quick break, and we're going to be joined by the Wizard of Oz, Professor David Eisenhouse, appearing on the Zoom screen to provide a comment today. And after that, we'll have much more time than yesterday for some question for a Q&A period. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Brett.
Okay, thank you all very much for coming or for coming back, whichever. I am really, really grateful to see you here for this second of my lectures. So lecture 2, Times of Change, Possibility, Virtue, and a Democratic Politics of Time. So just to recap briefly on yesterday, we were exploring this intriguing and perhaps, and certainly unfamiliar conception of moral possibility. So moral possibility sandwiches 2 things together: the idea that it's manageable, and therefore the idea that it's fairly frequent or you can expect it. So it's easiness, and with the idea that it's easy comes the idea that most people can manage it for a considerable stretch of time. Its contrast, moral impossibility, means something that's very hard, very difficult to do. And as a result, only a very few people can manage it, and even then, not for very long. And as we saw, this conception is susceptible of degrees. There's an extreme of impossibility. It's something that is so repugnant to our cultural or our natural sensibilities or inclinations. And I think that this conception is interesting today because it captures some of our core intuitions about a certain kind of cruelty and the inhuman, a certain way of psychologically forcing a person which is repugnant to them, but also repugnant to our own sensibilities. But there's also a kind of difficulty or impossibility short of that extreme. So this is the category of what's too hard, too difficult, harsh, let's say. And I think this is the domain of politics in mutatis mutandis, a recognizably democratic sense, or at least a popular sense, something that people popularly feel is a bit much, it's too hard, too much of a sacrifice for them to be asked to do it. And in this sense, if law has to be subject to the possibility condition in that way, I think what you're getting is a very political understanding of the obligation to obey the law. And that's something that's interesting about it. So I think that impossibility in its extreme sense crosses the confessional divide. I think we discussed this yesterday and actually over dinner. This is something that I think does get into Protestant jurisprudence, into the natural law tradition more broadly, and into the nascent notion of human rights. And I think putting possibility back in to our understanding of that helps with our understanding of that historical trajectory from natural rights to human rights today. This sort of more rich social sense, the idea that a law has to be easy in a kind of social way, I think that one was harder to cross the confessional divide from its genesis in Catholic Counter-Reformation thought. So part of what these lectures are doing is suggesting why it might be interesting for us to recover that dimension of the idea of moral possibility, as well as this concept that's more at the extreme. So today I want to pursue that thought a little further. So I want to explore the interface between law and politics further by thinking about possibility in terms of time. Now, in one sense, that seems obvious. Possibility seems almost, in the sense of the term, to imply a future. More accurately, we might think about possibility as a kind of opening between the present and the future through which we can realize our aims. But I want to stress also today that possibility is also an opening between the present and the past. So possibility invokes the way things are now, and the way things are now is a function of history, at least if we're thinking about sociocultural or customary possibility, what the scholastics call possible according to custom. But I think the same goes too, at least in some sense, for natural possibility or possibility according to nature. If we bear in mind that fluid interface between the natural and the cultural, and the way that kind of interface is itself historically constructed. So in any case, I want to say that the opening to the past as well as to the future is key to thinking about possibility as a condition of law in the sense of the morally possible, that existential sense of the possible as opposed simply to the practicable. And we were discussing that distinction yesterday. So in existential terms, we might say possibility is behind us as well as in front of us. Now, that opening to the past can seem sometimes to close the opening to the future, as when we think that things are impossible, right? There's no way that we can achieve our aims. The way that we are now precludes our moving forward. But conversely, sort of keeping that opening to the future can seem sometimes to require closing the opening to the past, as when we think we have to get rid of the past altogether. We have to have a revolution or perhaps an amnesty. And those states of one or the other, no opening to the future, no opening to the past, those states, both of them, are psychologically very hard indeed. We might call them times of impossibility. They're morally impossible. Now, it's a cliche, by contrast, that everyday politics is, quotes, the art of the possible. And I take it that the general sense of that term means possible in the sense of practicable. But our argument so far will suggest that any kind of long-term change within a framework of democratic or at least popularly responsive or accountable politics implicates the possible in its more existential sense, that sense of being poised somewhere between a past and a history and a future. And so we could think of the art of the possible in those terms as the art of getting the opening to the past and the opening to the future to line up, so that there is a kind of passage between the two. And I want to return here to Plutarch, the ancient philosopher, whose Solon and also whose Lycurgus we met in the previous lecture, and his essay on the precepts of statecraft. And he begins his essay by outlining how a statesman is to go about this delicate psychopolitical maneuvering, psychopolitical temporal maneuvering. So this is Plutarch in the more sort of positive or Lycurgan vein, I guess I would say, that Professor Lane was introducing in her comments to my lecture yesterday. So note the emphasis on time throughout in different degrees of temporality, so how the statesman is juggling with his own time in office as well as with the time of his subjects. So this kind of politics of time itself takes time. Now, this passage of Plutarch appealed enormously to the self-construction of educated Spanish officials in colonial, 16th century colonial Peru. So it provided them with an ethos of possible. It's not tyrannical. We're delicately maneuvering to bring our subjects into a better state. So it's not tyrannical government, at the same time as an apologia for their very limited effectiveness in some degrees. So here we are in Juan de Matienzo, his Gobierno del Perú of 1567. And this is his chapter on the character of the Indians. And I hope it's clear, I'm going to be very critical of these theorists, that when I sometimes use this term Indians, I am using it to emphasize my critical distance from them, not to align myself with anything that they are saying. Okay, so this is Matienzo in the first part, chapter 4, reference to the Politica of Plutarch. It comes up again in the first chapter of the second part, when he's talking more expansively about the self-construction of the ideal covenant. Plutarch is all over the place. I think it's interesting, and we'll come to this throughout this lecture, that in the second part, he's insistent that you have to know the character of the kinds of Spaniards who've made their home in Peru, as well as of the indigenous inhabitants. And we'll see throughout this lecture that theologians and lawyers reflecting on the politics of possibility in Spain and in the Spanish dominions think of the Spanish themselves as a political problem. But nevertheless, the overwhelming emphasis of this treatise is on the character and nature of the indigenous inhabitants. So we're going to come back to Peru in the third section of this lecture. But meanwhile, I want to press a little bit harder on the question of the morally impossible in the context of legislation. Okay, so what is a morally impossible law? You know, what would be an example of that? So we had one from Francisco Suarez in the last lecture. So this is a law requiring people, that's ordinary people, the whole population, to undergo a bread and water fast. And I think the riff for the whole of Lent is in fact from Gabriel Vasquez, whom we're about to meet, but the idea is the same. So this is an example of impossible according to nature. It's really, really hard. Bread and water for an extended period of time. So they would think that this is so contrary to natural human psychology that most people are just not going to be able to manage it. So at a certain point, they're going to crack and, as I said, have a cheeseburger. Now, I take it that not everyone, and actually it's key that not everyone is going to crack, but most people will, and that's the political point. Now, here is another, and this is from Gabriel Vasquez, and this is Suarez's exact contemporary and a bit of his kind of bête noire intellectual antagonist, Gabriel Vasquez. So it's from almost exactly the same time. And again, he's commenting on the Prima Secunda, and he's commenting on that key chapter on the conditions of law. So this is impossible according to custom. So here he says that a law requiring everyone to treat everyone else with equal honor or dignity or respect, well, it would satisfy the first two conditions of law. So it would be honest or morally good. I mean, it would be great. And it would also be just in the sense that it's laid equally upon everybody. Everybody has to treat each other with equal respect. So it's honest and it's just, but it's not possible. It's impossible given the social psychology of an early modern European estate society. And even more so in Spain, where the acute honor culture was often a cause for comment among these very sociologically minded theologians. So to go back to a point that I made yesterday, legislating the morally possible is the antithesis of revolution, right? And indeed, it can be conservative to the point of what we might call reactionary. But the fact that law imposed across a run of individuals, a multitude, is subject to the possibility condition in this sense, doesn't mean that you can't revolutionize your own life. Right? And the scholastic central example of this, as suggested by the examples of impossibility we've just looked at, is their own case, so entering a religious order. So a religious order will lay very stringent demands on an individual. Foundationally, those of obedience, poverty, and chastity, but there are going to be many, many others on top. And for Counter-Reformation theologians, these demands are morally impossible. That is, they're too hard for most people for any length of time. They require a very high degree of virtue being understood as the ability to overcome both your natural and your psychosocial or sociocultural psychology. And critically, they require it for life. There's no going back. You're closing off that opening to the past where moral possibility is situated. So in taking your vows, you're making that degree of virtue mandatory for you forever. It falls under precept in their own language. So you can no longer protest to your superior that what he or she is asking is too hard, and therefore you don't have to do it. You sign up to a life without the normal possibility condition attached. And there are some, I can discuss some examples of that if you're interested in the Q&A. So any individual can voluntarily undertake to live the life of a subject without the normal possibility condition attached. But all of them are clear that no law can command it. Even divine law, they think, doesn't do so. So Suarez is very clear. Divine law does not command perpetual chastity of everyone. Too hard. Yeah. So this is supererogation. Remember, we are in the high Counter-Reformation. These people are not Lutherans, and they believe in a category of supererogatory virtue. And I thought it's worthwhile hearing at this point, hearing from a woman. So this is Arcangela Tarabotti, and this extraordinary work called Paternal Tyranny, precisely, tyranny, written by a Venetian woman in the mid-17th century, forced into a convent by her father. And it's on the psychological agony of involuntary committal to a life of supererogation, a life without the normal condition of moral possibility. So a quote that I didn't put on the slide, she said, "There is no eloquence to persuade human minds of the reality of this state of life in which involuntary and therefore false nuns experience one misfortune after another and then eternal torments. Their lives have beginnings and no ends. Gnaw but do not consume, kill but do not put to death." So that's that psychological agony of being forced to this against your will. And she explicitly compares this, as I put in the quote, to pharaonic tyranny. And she goes on to invoke the decrees of Trent on the clausura, on the cloistering of nuns. And she's very well aware of this tridentine moral possibility language. She says the point about what they were doing was that it wasn't going to be harsh for people who wanted to do it. But for people who don't, it is torment. So no human law can command this. Yeah. But the fact that human law can't legislate for this level of virtue doesn't mean, and I think this is key, that doesn't mean that human law legislating for across the multitude can't legislate for any virtue at all, right? So Thomas Aquinas had been clear that human law can command in the acts of all the virtues, courage and temperance, for example, as well as justice. So the imperative to make things easy for subjects is not for these theologians of pandering to vice, although inevitably that's the way it was constructed by their Protestant adversaries. On the contrary, they think that making things difficult for people is itself likely to create vice among the population, given the general run of people's capacities. So they think it takes virtue to obey any law, even a relatively easy or possible one. So, this lower level of virtue is still virtue, and there's a kind of respect for that popular degree of virtue that may nevertheless not be very elevated. But the point is that if the law is possible, then the law can legitimately expect you to produce the virtue needed to obey it. So it will fall under precept for you at that level. So can the law ever require you to produce more virtue than normal? That is, to raise the threshold of what is possible for you. And scholastic theologians addressed the issue in a new question that became a standard addition to the commentary literature on the laws. Can human law oblige one to keep it with danger of any kind of temporal harm, even death? And just as an aside, it's the fact that this critically important chapter of Suarez is not included in the standard English translation of the De Legibus, which is excerpted, is another kind of index of the erasure of possibility and the possibility condition from the history of natural law jurisprudence. Not only Catholic, I would say, but Protestant, because this question is a key site of transference between the two. So now it's important that this question doesn't relate only to death or even to various forms of grievous physical harm. It extends to your social standing, to your family, to your material possessions as well. Understanding all of these is woven together into the fabric of your life. And they sometimes put this from the opposite direction in terms of what you justly fear losing. Not just your everyday fears, but what you justly fear losing. And the major authority, another Jesuit, the major authority on marriage, Thomas Sanchez, addressed this topic of fear in the fourth book of his enormously influential work on marriage. Now, the fifth disputation is on coerced consent, precisely, to marriage. And he's covering what kinds of fears through which you might have consented count as just and therefore excusing you from your obligation. So a just fear is, and I'll come to this a little bit more in a minute, sometimes called a fear that befalls a constant man. So it's not just any old fear. It's a kind of strong, justifiable fear. So what does he put under that heading? Fear of death, of the mutilation of a limb, of grave bodily agony or torment, of slavery, captivity, grievous exile, not just, a bearable exile, but an unbearable kind of exile. Long-term prison, not just, in jail for a few days, that's okay. Long-term, you can do it. Even if you have a not very high level of virtue, you can do that. But long-term prison, no, that is unbearable. Also, what he calls atrocious chains, and I guess, again, maybe handcuffs for a few hours is okay, but to be prisoned in chains, that's not. Loss of status and honor, so dishonor, rape, infamy, equally. Loss of a large patrimony, and then there's a very extended casuistry about just how large, how much do I have to lose before it actually counts as a just fear? Could it be like just a considerable portion? All of it? One of the examples is selling your house for a lot less than it's worth. Sanchez does not. And then again, so I'm slightly caricaturing here because this is the fun side of the casuistry, but this is also, I think, the interesting side of the casuistry. These are our everyday concerns, right? I think these plug into the way that most people think about their lives. And that's why I think this language is democratically available in a way that more elevated conceptions of virtue are not. But I will say here, Tom Sanchez doesn't really want to go down that route, but certainly a loss of a large patrimony counts as a just fear. So just fear, fear that befalls a constant man. So this concept is gendered, but not always to the exclusion of women. So, for example, a woman can fear rape, even if she's extremely courageous, right? And that fear is a really strong example of a just fear. Pertinent to Tarabotti's case, Domingo de Soto, whom we'll meet again in a minute, argued that a daughter's fear of her parents counts as just fear. So if she goes into a nunnery because she's afraid of what her parents will do to her if she doesn't, then that's going to excuse from her vows. Now, scholastic theologians thought that women are in general less courageous than men, but they also thought that some men aren't very courageous either. And this is my asterisk at the bottom of this page. They argue that just fear is relative to the possibility threshold of the individual concerned. All right? So if the very thought of danger, even mild danger, makes you turn to jelly, then clearly a law requiring you to stand up to danger is less possible for you than for a sturdier type of person, even if you are a man. Okay, so bearing all that in mind, do you have to die or to endure these kinds of things rather than disobey a human law? Right? Do you have to face down your just fears, not merely your anxieties, worries, general trepidation? And the answer to these questions was no, not normally, at least. In most cases, you will have the right to obey, because to oblige you with danger of death, to obey a human law with danger of death or loss of all these things defies the possibility condition. It's impossible to be subject to that kind of law all of the time. Your life is impossible, morally impossible. However, scholastic theologians were clear that in some situations, human law can legitimately command the morally impossible, and with that, a higher level of virtue than it would normally be legitimate to expect. So the classic examples here are time of war and time of plague, which are ubiquitously paralleled as situations in which, at the limit, ordinary citizens can be commanded to remain in a situation of extreme danger, just as soldiers, and again this is a ubiquitous parallel, can be commanded to stand at their post by their military superiors, even with danger of death. And although I really wanted to stick with the, and I am sticking with the Catholic casuistry here because it's less familiar, I don't think this is, I think Hobbes's Leviathan on the liberty of subjects is an example of the crossover between this kind of question, does the law oblige with danger of death, and the Protestant natural law jurisprudence. I think Hugo Grotius is in the background here, but we've left him out for today. So Hobbes's true liberty of subjects are the things which, though commanded by the sovereign, he may nevertheless, without injustice, refuse to do. Notice this covers dangerous or dishonorable. Why dishonorable as well as dangerous? Because both of those are morally impossible, right? I don't think that Hobbes has the entire range of what the scholastics would consider morally impossible, but I think he's got some of it. And this is why the casuistry isn't simply about death or self-preservation. Dishonor is psychologically unbearable for a person of a certain kind of status. And what he argues here is that if our refusal can stand together with the end of the Commonwealth, then we may disobey. If it's not, then we can't. And somehow we're going to have to find that virtue to do those things, even with that cost to ourselves. Now, most scholastics deployed a kind of standard part-whole analogy in justification of this position. Although by the mid-17th century, we do find some of them using a kind of covenantal model similar to Hobbes's. So the basic argument here is that the citizen is a member of the body politic, and if it comes to it, the member must sacrifice their own individual life for the sake of the life of the whole body. So that raised a question for them, and they don't agree on this subject. So I don't want to suggest they're all of the same opinion. So they ask here, okay, is that obligation at that point really an obligation of human law? Or effectively, are we talking about a natural law obligation here? So some people think, no, actually, because human law can't of itself command the morally impossible, if at any point it does, it's because that obligation ultimately reduces to natural law. But others thought that this command of human law is actually irreducible to natural law. Okay, there's some natural law in the background, but there's just a natural law in the background to any kind of human law. But the command to this particular person to stand in that particular place at that particular time, they thought was irreducible to natural law, and therefore they thought, theologians who on this position, human law must be able of itself to command the morally impossible. So very interesting disagreement there about what kind of obligation this is. But whatever their position on that question, all of them are clear that the admittedly very high level of virtue involved is nevertheless not supererogatory. So even if it's an obligation of natural law, it's not supererogation because natural law precisely does not command the impossible. That's their position against the Lutherans. So for them, obligation with danger of death is the ineliminable price of citizenship, and the courage needed to endure it falls under precept. So the point here is that war and plague are not seen as states of exception to the normal conditions of law, but a kind of ratcheting up of the possibility condition. It's not like entering a religious order, which no law can command. So there's a difference, key difference there. And part of that difference was the supposition that the kind of raised possibility threshold that's required to meet a situation of war or plague doesn't have to be maintained for very long, certainly not for life. So as the mid-17th century scholastic philosopher Rodrigo de Arriaga put it, it's far more bearable to overcome a grave difficulty on one single occasion than to be obliged to do so for all time. So the temporal limit on what you're being asked to do falls within natural possibility, even though at an elevated level it's still not supererogatory. And Arriaga couldn't think, he said, of any reason why the common good might require a law to demand something so difficult from everyone permanently. And the implication of that thought is the common good must lie elsewhere, so that something requiring a very high level of virtue permanently just isn't a political community, because the condition of the political is that it has to be morally possible for its population. Scholastic theologians were also clear that the tightening or this ratcheting up of the possibility condition couldn't be universal across the entirety of the citizen body at every moment in time, even for the shorter duration of war or a plague situation. So authors like Suarez were fond of recalling a key clarification that the mid-16th century Dominican theologian Domingo de Soto, whom we've already had. So Soto made a key clarification to the head and members analogy. So I've taken a photo of a statue of him in Segovia, just from the public domain of the web. So if he's holding a book with his the tag quis scit sotum scit totum. So the person who knows Soto knows everything. So I commend the reading of Soto to you for that reason alone. Anyway, sort of. So he makes this key clarification. So everyone, cites head and members, body, and expects it to do the work. And Soto says, well, it's not going to do the work in every situation, because actually the analogy is not entirely apt. A citizen does not, in fact, stand in relation to the Commonwealth like a hand or a foot to the body, because a hand or a foot doesn't have a being separate from that of the body, whereas a citizen does. So the relationship is different. The Commonwealth does not own the lives of its citizens. The life of a citizen isn't fully integrated into the life of the body in a kind of ownership model. It says it only has a kind of custodianship for the sake of the common good. So as a result, the Commonwealth can't assume your sacrifice personally to you if your specific life isn't needed to serve the Commonwealth. For such a demand to be legitimate, there has to be a very clear correlation between its life and your death. And if that clear and transparent relationship doesn't obtain, then we have a legitimate place for the casuistry of non-obligation. And although war is, they're sort of, if you like, the classic case, as I say, they are equally interested in plague. And I think the casuistry of plague gives you much more of a sense of this textured obligation of human law at a particular time of stress across all the different social strata of the community. So it's sociologically sensitive in a way that the kind of more abstract political theory isn't. So I'm going to look at the casuistry of plague for a moment now. So it's a bit of a cliche that the recent pandemic, but I was writing, getting to grips with this topic in the course of the pandemic. So that sparked an intense discussion precisely about the relationship between what the state can command and what the individual is obliged to do, the reach of state power over the lives of citizens. And it also sparked a renewed interest in early modern plague regulation, and there was a lot of literature bringing those two into parallel. And indeed, I mean, the parallels are striking, so that the language of war was as ubiquitous in the 21st century as in the 16th or the 17th. For example, we talked about people being on the front line, and they talked about that in those terms too. Then, as now, the rhetoric of necessity was readily available, to justify the assumption of emergency powers and legislation that bypasses normal processes of democratic scrutiny and accountability. But for the early modern theologians and lawyers who thought about this question, at least ones that I'm interested in, plague is not a blanket state of emergency or exception in which the possibility condition doesn't apply at all. So like war, plague is understood to have its own local texture of space and time. And this generates a minute dissection of how much could be demanded of what elements of the population at what points in the trajectory of the disease. I think partly because plague and indeed war were not unusual situations in early modern Europe, contemporaries knew how to keep asking the same political questions about possibility, like, do I have to, really? That they would in any other circumstances. So it's not an exception to the normal state of the political, but it is a kind of a ratcheting up within it. So a simple appeal to necessity was not by itself good enough to justify obligation with danger of death on this specific citizen at this specific time, or other grave temporal harm. Now, again, in the recent pandemic, the passing of emergency, that's their word, legislation to contain contagion, meant that the law concerned itself with the minute texture of people's lives, the domain in which moral possibility is materially, spatially, and I would say temporally articulated. So that's really the subject of this lecture, this kind of concrete articulation a moral possibility in terms of time and place. And one consequence that commentators quickly noticed was the asymmetric burden of psychological stress, moral impossibility on the poor. And this is a consequence that's well known to early modern writers. So intrusive spatial regulation is harder on people in tighter spaces and people with fewer means. So here is an example from the Barnabite friar Filiberto Marchini. So this is written during the terrible plague in Florence in 1630 to 31, published in 1633, Bellum Divinum, divine war, plague as the arrows of God, not human war. So Marchini is writing in and in defense of a strict Italian system of quarantine enforced by the officials of the Sanità, the Public Health Board. So he certainly thinks that this kind of intervention is legitimate. But he was well aware that an aristocrat, for example, could go to a country estate or just have a big palazzo in town. So, you know, he can find an isolated room there without too much psychological stress. I mean, it will be stressful, but it's not unbearable. By contrast, the poor will either have to be forcibly contained in close proximity at a huge risk of cross-infection, or forced to leave and endure the agony, the psychological agony of separation from relatives and friends, leaving your friends in a danger zone and being forcibly separated. So more virtue, then as now, was being demanded of those who are least able to produce it. So here is an example from, so these most bitter, that's the bitter calamities of plague, and he talks about the forcible separation. This is acutely repugnant. It's morally impossible. But the social asymmetries of subjection to plague regulation led people in early modern Europe to question the power of the state, what they would call the Commonwealth, to impose this kind of regulation. And it caused them to question not only the nature of the obligation and of the regulation, but also the nature of the virtue that plague time demands. So the common good ideology, espoused by Marchini and many others who are defending this quarantine system, essentially appealed to courage or fortitude. This is the virtue that's going to close that possibility gap, enable you to meet the elevated demands of the law. Remembering again the ubiquitous parallel with war. So it's a kind of martial virtue on the part of the people, a call for collective sacrifice, which lines up effectively with the broader rationale of the Commonwealth and of human power over human beings. But cross-confessionally, and one thing I think is very interesting about the plague casuistry is that its positions are not consistent across a confessional divide. People on both sides of all confessions think differently about plague. So cross-confessionally, those opposed to, or at least more hesitant about, this kind of strict quarantine regulation that Marchini is defending, pitted the Christian virtue of charity against this kind of martial fortitude. So they insisted that charity also requires courage, but it runs in a different direction from the direction of the law. So charity suggests you should precisely not abandon your neighbors, your relatives, or your friends, or quarantine a number of people in a small house and leave them to survive or not, or throw them out of their houses into unfamiliar places where they're vulnerable to exposure and depredation. And evidence from London, early modern London, and this is reflected in the theological sermons and treatises of the time, shows that people of lower social class, people who don't have the means to leave, they can't pay for the journey, tended to insist instead on the Christian virtue of staying, of charity, and the unlawfulness of leaving as contrary to God's providence. So that kind of position shows the same kind of intersection of temporality and virtue in meeting the demand for the morally impossible, but it does it in a different key, and one that doesn't line up with the desires of the authorities to contain the plague. So people who don't have means, people who are socially more pressured by this regulation, adopt a different understanding of what virtue is and a different understanding of the temporality. Here, the temporality of God's providence, more unknowable, rather than the time of the state and the time of the state's law. So it's still a requirement for heightened virtue, but this time one that resists the law rather than rises to meet it. Okay, so for the third section of this lecture, I want to come back to, as promised, to another time, another place, and this is colonial Peru. So Peru under colonial Spanish administration in the late 1560s and 1570s. So it's in the same time and the same chronological span of time. But in terms of social and political time, the time that's relevant to the possibility condition, it's worlds away. And what's interesting about the situation at the time, and this is recognized by some of the people who are writing there, in a way there is no time. Because the Spaniards have destroyed the Inca Empire, but there's nothing as yet in its place. Peru is in chaos. Now, in this chaos, the crown had decreed that the indigenous inhabitants, the Indians, Indios as they were called, they were not slaves, right? If they're not slaves, then they are subjects, and if they're subjects, then the law should be possible for them. But how can the possibility condition, normal conditions of government for anyone who's not a slave, be compatible with their systematic subjection to the colonizers under the encomienda system? And in particular, they were concerned with the continuing practice and indeed expansion of the mita, the indigenous, the Inca system of public labor. How can that be compatible with the possibility condition? Now, famously, the Dominican friar Bartolome de las Casas argued that this is entirely inconsistent. So Las Casas spent his life protesting the appalling cruelty practiced by the encomenderos towards their indigenous subjects, to the point of effectively accusing the crown of complicity in tyranny. And Las Casas' position continued to have vocal support within the missionary orders. But those close to the new governor, Francisco de Toledo, who arrived in 1570, sought to justify the entrenchment of legal differentiation as a condition of imposing order and imposing time, I would say, in this new world of Peru. And one of them, the one we're going to look at in this section, is the Jesuit José de Acosta. So he was at odds with the Las Casistas, the sympathizers within his own society. He's impressed with colonial officials like Juan de Matienzo and Polo de Ondegardo, although he still seeks to hold some kind of line against the worst excesses of the encomenderos. So the third book of Acosta's work, De Procuranda Indorum Salute, I'll put it up on the screen in a minute, on procuring the salvation of the Indians, is on civil government. And one of its strategies is to mobilize the possibility condition to justify differential legislation for colonizers and colonized, even while arguing that they make up one commonwealth or república. Okay, so as I mentioned in the first lecture, ethnography was a key component of possibility thinking in the Old World. So it's standard to refer to the difference between the Germans and the Spanish, for example, in terms of what laws are possible for these very different kinds of people. So it's well embedded in thinking about Europe, but it's also famously an immediate resource of legally trained colonial officials and theologians seeking to establish some kind of workable system of justice in the new. So in Peru, the colonial official Polo de Ondegardo made a series of sustained inquiries into the old Inca order. And Acosta himself is best known for his natural and moral history of the Indies, his ethnographic account of the customs and the natural history of the place. So in one sense, this Spanish interest in indigenous customs, this is the moral history, has rightly been seen as domesticating them within a familiar Castilian framework of legal pluralism, where the existence of different laws, different legislative fora, was standard, and customary law would be expected to govern cases alongside statute law. So I think, and I don't want to deny that there's a kind of domestication and familiarization in those terms. But as we've been seeing in these lectures, the force of custom is strongly associated with the possibility condition, what's possible according to custom. And in that light, I think these kind of legal ethnographic reports or relaciones can be seen as kinds of possibility surveys. They're attempts to establish the pre-existing ground of the possible as the basis for new legislation that supposedly respects the possibility condition and therefore does not treat the indigenous people as slaves. So the question is, what are they used to? What can they take, right? What legislation will not be tyrannical for them, violate the moral possibility condition, even if it would be for Spaniards? So, as scholars of both Mexico and Peru have pointed out, these surveys are not simply reports of what's there before. They are imperial co-productions between Spanish officials and indigenous agents who are already practicing a kind of active subjection in the terms we looked at in the last lecture, in shaping their history in a way that could be digested and operationalized by their new governors. And it's been recently argued, a really great new book by Yana Yannakakis called Since Time Immemorial on Custom, that this translation of indigenous social and political history into a form of custom digestible to Europeans represents another technique of imperial control in the guise of respecting the ways of their new subjects. Right? It's possible according to custom in this ideology. So hence the hollowness of the appeal to Plutarch in Matienzo and also in Acosta, I would say. Getting to know the ways of the people is fundamentally compromised if those ways are not, in fact, their ways, but already warped into a new form that has no history except one of destruction, as Las Casas had said. So whose past, and who will say what past it is that you are respecting, and whose ways of the people? Now, interestingly, José de Acosta was acutely aware of the damage done by these kinds of false history or false past on the Spanish side. So he thought the encomienda, the institution of the encomienda, was itself a kind of false past. It was a sort of shadow of Spanish nobility, deliberately designed to make Spaniards feel at home in the New World and therefore stay there. So Acosta was clear-sighted about the way in which the Spanish crown had used private citizens to conquer, extend, and maintain its empire. So the institution of the encomienda the allocation of a certain number of Indians to Spanish, originally the conquistadores, that itself was a strategic manipulation of psychological possibility on the part of the crown. And Acosta doesn't think there's anything that can be done about this. It's entrenched. And he says lower status Spaniards who come out to the Indies also replicate Spanish ideas of gentility by refusing to do any manual labor themselves. And he can't see, as I said, any solution to this destructive transference of a Spanish past to Peru. It's happened. And he says, what remedy? I don't know. But effectively, he capitulates. Spanish colonizers have to be allowed to stay in their psychological comfort zone, even while he recognizes that this fatally compromises the prospects of setting just parameters of possibility in this new República. So instead, the burden of psychological stress has to fall on the indigenous. Now, Paulo de Ondegardo, to whom Acosta was close and he's very impressed by, was himself an encomendero. So Ondegardo argued strenuously for keeping as much as of the old Inca order as possible, especially the system of organized indigenous labor, the mita. So he said changing it is going to destroy the Indians who are used to nothing else. So we don't have to legislate it out of existence. It's actually good for them to continue doing it because it's actually part of their past. This is who they are. And in many respects, Acosta followed suit. So one instance, so Acosta has a whole chapter on taxation in personal services, basically the perpetuation of a system of compulsory labor. Is this just? So one example is the mita de tambo. So the tambo was a way station, and it's the practice of using, effectively, compulsory indigenous labor to carry packs over otherwise unpassable tracts. And Matienzo, Ondegardo, and Acosta all agreed that outlawing the practice, which is what the crown had done, was not workable in Peru. So Acosta here, and this is the passage on the screen, he condemned the way that the original conquistadors had used the indigenous as literally as animals, pack animals, loading them up under intolerable, they chained them together and they killed them when they fell under the weight. And Acosta does condemn that. But he wanted to argue that the ameliorated version, as practiced by their successors, was not tyrannical. It's not impossible, either in the sense of physical cruelty or in the sense of psychologically repugnant for the indigenous people of the region. So you'll see towards the bottom of that, we cannot approve the over-delicate hesitation of some people who do not see that what someone is accustomed to is not actually only not unwelcome, but actually pleasant. And they think that the sensibilities and minds of all people should be measured by their own. So this is ethnographic difference in the service of a differential possibility condition on the indigenous and on the Spanish. But you can still argue that you're respecting the possibility condition, so it's not tyrannical. So this really shows the possibility condition in its worst form of mobilization, an asymmetric decision on possibility based on a flawed reconstruction of a culture and its past, in conditions where the non-elite indigenous cannot articulate their own understanding, and the elite indigenous are already practicing active subjection in creating something livable for themselves. So what Acosta and all these people don't acknowledge is that the mita has already changed. It's not what they're used to. The commercial colonial institution of the way station or the tambo is not the same as the Inca tampu. Matienzo and Acosta were happy to point out that change in one respect, the fact that the indigenous were paid something, a pittance, for their labor as they had not been in Inca times. So they say, well, you know, so it's not actually slavery because that they're paid. And they made a comparison with porters in Europe. I mean, we load up porters for a price. I mean, what's impossible about that? The difference, of course, is that these people cannot refuse to do it. They can't set their own terms. They can't price their own time. So the colonial tambo is a commercial institution, but the indigenous are not in that kind of market. They're half in, half out. Part of, but not actually participating in, the imperialist capitalist economy. Now, Acosta did, oh no, I seem to have lost a slide. Okay, Acosta did consider the argument that being forced to labor is itself slavery. So even if the work is tolerable, even if you're accustomed to it, what about the fact that forcing you to do it, the fact that you've got no choice, isn't that itself slavery? So that what it is about slavery is that you're physically forced to do something unwillingly, and that is the essential repugnance of the condition. And it's not taken away by the fact that it might be possible for you or it might be paid. It is in itself morally impossible. It's that forcing. And Acosta doesn't really have any answer to that. So he says this is a difficult question, and it's remarkable how many difficult questions Peru throws up for Acosta. But what he appeals to is the statue of Daniel from the dream in the book of Daniel. Again, I'm using the authorized version of here. So what he wants to argue is that if the indigenous don't do this labor, then the republic can't stand because someone's got to do it, and Spaniards aren't going to do it because it's drudge-like and sordid. And to justify this, he used this image of the statue. So this image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, and here we get to it, his feet part of iron and part of clay. So Acosta insisted that the Spaniards and the indigenous together make one commonwealth, one res publica. It's not two. But he focused on this difference between the iron and the clay in the feet. So the iron bit of the feet is the more lower class Spaniards. The clay is the indigenous. And therefore it's not to be wondered at, he says, if sometimes the iron squeezes the clay a little. So it's not tyranny, but he's arguing that to keep this new republic, to get it going, psychological stress has to fall somewhere, and it's going to fall on the clay. Short of tyranny, he argues, but still a kind of pressure that they simply have to take. How long do they have to do that for? No one could say. So that crucial question for the political in the old world, like how long do I have to keep this up, could not be answered in the new. So it was only answered by figuring the Indians as children who, as Acosta said, they have to be learned to be human and then to be Christian before they can have equal political status. And Ondegardo said the same thing. Their true liberty is to live as it is appropriate for them to live, as children, until time shows that they have the capacity to be treated in a different way. So as children, they have no possibility behind them, right? The possibility is all ahead of them. So they're kind of caught between a false political past, this mythical Inca order, which is already gone, and having no past at all. So by using the figure of the Indian as the child, Acosta and Ondegardo were effectively giving the new republic time to grow its own past. on the back of pressure on the indigenous. So we would expect the birth of a new republic to be what I called at the start a time of impossibility, demanding a very high degree of virtue from its citizens. But there's scarcely any mention of virtue anywhere in this dismal third book of Acosta's treatise. And I think that's because there's no real political time at all. The Spanish are not being very virtuous because they're being allowed to stay in their comfort zone of a Spanish past at the cost of squeezing this indigenous clay. Acosta knows that that's not great. But the clay isn't figures as capable of virtue at all because they're like children who are not yet capable of either virtue or vice. So the only breath of virtue lies in the figure of this wise Plutarchan governor, making life possible for them, supposedly, as they are in this undefined meantime of the new republic. And I think it's to Acosta's small credit that he did recognize, I think, how inadequate that was. Okay, I conclude now. So, briefly. So what's interesting about this meditation, though, is that it's a new commonwealth, it's a new world, it's about the creation of possibility. How are we going to make things possible in a situation where it looks impossible from so many angles? So to sum up, I think this early modern meditation on possibility as a condition of law, in the terms that I've set out in this lecture, reveals a kind of complicated relationship between time, virtue, and the kind of material articulation of possibility in time, in terms of space, and also in terms of resources, thinking about this noble with his palazzo in town. So I think thinking about possibility, thinking about what's possible and what is not, implicates a decision on time. What kind of time do we live in? But I think the parallel of that is also that we have to decide on what is virtue and what is not. So it's not just a question of what's possible, but it's a question of what is the virtue that we might need to meet times that are more difficult. So I think that time of plague in Europe and this colonial devastation in Peru show how difficult any kind of democratic agreement is in situations of pronounced social division, where people have very different pasts, very different material and spatial conditions of life, and very different understandings of virtue. So decisions taken asymmetrically by this wise legislator, failing to acknowledge the subjective element of possibility. It's not, someone can't tell you what's morally possible for you. Failing to recognize the subject's eye viewpoint, make life effectively impossible for subjects. But conversely, a democratic agreement on subjects on a shared possibility and the shared virtue to go through with a kind of heightened version of that looks equally intractable if we have this kind of pronounced social difference. And there isn't any escape in the creation of false pasts, either by a ruler or by the people, familiar though that strategy is as a technique of management. It only leads to a hypocrisy in the present that blocks any passable channel between the possibility that's behind us and the possibility that lies ahead. I had an example, but I think I'm going to leave it there because am I out of time? Ish.
We've got a few more minutes, yeah.
A few more minutes, okay. So what would it be like to take a democratic decision on possibility? So I'll just briefly come back to Soto. I know I'm making him into a bit of a hero, and I worry about that. But I still think this is great. So we don't have, as I say, any examples of democratic deliberation on possibility in the early modern period. But here is Domingo de Soto's deliberation in the cause of the poor. And I think this is a remarkable work of what we might call allyship with the very poor, that is, with beggars. So the context is the Spanish are enacting a new poor law of the kind that they're doing in Northern Europe, which would contain the poor in hospitals, not allow them to travel, give them sort of rations and set them to work, that kind of poor law. And Soto is arguing for the impossibility, the moral impossibility of that kind of poor law. And one of his arguments is the impossibility in Spain of instituting that kind of poor law reform. So public upkeep of the poor is impossible in Spain. And he makes it clear that we're talking about the morally possible. So as he says, the strength of this argument is increased by the character and condition of the Spaniards. Compared to other people, the Spaniards are more easily persuaded by hearing a personal plea and seeing the misery of the beggars than being coerced by law. Citizens are as horrified at the idea of having to register for the sake of almsgiving as they are at the thought of having to pay taxes. I mean, the Spanish are not very, I think he says they're not very politicky. And I think the translation of that is civic-minded. They're not very political in that sense, unlike in Flanders. So they're never going to actually contribute to this public upkeep because of the way that he thinks it might work somewhere else, but not in Spain. So the result of this is that Soto argues that a poor law of a Flanders type, Northern European type, is immorally impossible in Spain, and as a result, the Crown cannot legislate it because it defies the possibility condition. He argues that beggars must have the right to access private charity by being allowed to beg freely on the streets. They must be able to travel in an unlimited way to do so, including across borders. And here is that spatiality of possibility that I mentioned earlier. I think Soto is clear, and I think it's as true then as it is now, that a true democracy of possibility can't be contained within the borders of one political place. It must cross those borders. So I will cease there. But this kind of allyship, this sympathetic entering into the texture of life and into the conditions of the possibility of the poor, enables Soto to make an argument in justice for them being able to continue with this way of life. In the meantime, in this time of the Spanish monarchy, in which public upkeep, so that's decent food, decent clothing, all at public expense, isn't available. So that really would be a revolution, he suggests. Thank you.
Thank you for another incredibly stimulating lecture. Let's take 5 minutes, and we'll rejoin with David Eisenhower. Okay, let's get started with our commentator. So I would like to say that it is a great honor and a great pleasure to introduce your Tanner commentator and my friend, David Eisenhower, the University Professor of Law and Philosophy at the University of Toronto. It's certainly an honor, but it is anything but a pleasure because he is in Toronto, not Berkeley, and I'm sad and angry. I think you can guess why he isn't here. Though David is, I think, reasonably Canada-philic, it's not the stupid Terrafor and the 51st state saber-rattling. The reason is the Trump administration's assault on the dignity and privacy of travelers, and the still unbelievable to me risk that travelers will be singled out by a border agent for questioning, device confiscation, and detention. And I say that realizing that that unbelievable risk is a risk that somebody who looks like me or like David is becoming aware of. I know that that is a risk that many people have faced for a long time, but I think we are now in a genuinely different time. Add to that the special risk of being one of the world's experts on fascist law and forms of legal oppression, and I think you can understand why David, with a heavy heart, is here only on Zoom. Let me tell you about David. He was born in South Africa and grew up there, and completed his BA and LLB at the University of Witwatersrand, where he performed so brilliantly he was appointed a full-time lecturer in the School of Law. He was subsequently awarded a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, where he read for a DPhil while also holding part-time lectureships in the Faculty of Laws at University College London and at Queen Mary University of London. That DPhil resulted in what became his first book, now a genuine classic and in its second edition, Hard Cases in Wicked Legal Systems. That work drew on his experience of South Africa's apartheid law to look at how judges trying to find glimmers of human dignity and rights can try to find space in the interstices of evil legal systems. It blends legal philosophy with acute attention to history and politics, and offered a brilliant corrective to the armchair sociology of much Anglophone legal theory at the time, and even since. After his time in the UK, David moved to Canada in 1988, where he took up a Canada Research Fellowship at Queen's University in Kingston. In 1990, he was appointed assistant professor in both law and philosophy at the University of Toronto, and today he holds the Albert Chair of Law at that university and has had the rank of university professor since 2015. David is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and a corresponding fellow of the British Academy. In addition to South Africa, England, and Canada, David has taught in Singapore, New Zealand, Hungary, Mexico, and the United States, and has held visiting fellowships or professorships at universities including Cambridge, New York University, and Oxford. In 2023, he was awarded the Gold Medal in the annual Impact Awards of Canada's Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. I think it's pronounced SHIRC, its highest honor. His scholarship has also had a significant impact on law and policy beyond academia, influencing courts and activists in Canada and internationally, including the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Among the many virtues that make David a professional role model for me, as well as for the very many young scholars he has nurtured, are the ways he blends a profound moral commitment for justice with exquisite analytical skill, looking at the often extraordinarily subtle ways injustice and cruelty can work their way into law. Among his many insights are his concept of a legal gray hole. This is David's term for a legal space in which there are some legal constraints on executive action, but the constraints are so insubstantial that they may as well let government do as it pleases. Gray holes, in David's view, can be more pernicious than black holes because they can shroud injustice with a glimmer of legitimacy. Sound familiar? Let me return to David's bibliography. David's books include that classic, as I say, Hard Cases in Wicked Legal Systems, but also Judging the Judges, Judging Ourselves, Truth, Reconciliation, and the Apartheid Legal Order, about South Africa. His J.C. Smuts Memorial Lectures at Cambridge were published as The Constitution of Law, Legality in a Time of Emergency, and his most recent book is The Long Arc of Legality, Hobbes, Kelsen, and Hart, which came out with Cambridge in 2022. And I'll just give a personal recommendation to the last book, The Long Arc of Legality. It's a beautiful book with these really subtle and surprising readings of these giants of legal theory, Hobbes, Kelsen, and Hart, and many others along the way. It's really one of the most interesting books in legal theory, and in my view, to appear in a long time. I'm going to quote here the dedication of his alma mater, Witwatersrand, which awarded him an honorary doctorate last year. And actually, truth be told, I plagiarized ruthlessly from that dedication. Professor Dysenhouse's many publications reflect his abiding fascination with the rule of law and the possibilities for resistance that exist even within an oppressive legal system, themes that resonate with his upbringing in pre-democratic South Africa and the training in law and political theory he received at WITS. It was at WITS, first as a student and then as a junior academic, that he developed his abiding interest in the way in which law, even when it is used as an instrument of oppression, as it was in the apartheid area of South Africa, opened up a space for resistance and challenge to it. Lawyers could, despite the oppressive nature of a law, craft arguments to resist the very law that the state sought to impose. I think it's obvious that David's work on oppressive laws, often invoked in service of specious claims of emergency and terrorism, could not possibly be more urgent today. His work over the last few years has focused on law and the lack of law in the West Bank. it's now become extremely helpful in thinking about our current predicament here south of his border. Fortunately, David also offers a message of hope in his work. To quote him, quote, "There are resources internal to law that make it possible for resistance to happen against oppression and discrimination, even when one has a government that is determined to use the law as both an instrument of oppression and discrimination." David very kindly Zoom attended my seminar. It was supposed to be in person. The seminar I was teaching this morning on legislation and constitutionalism, and spent a few hours with the students. And although the seminar has, for obvious reasons, been had a rather dark theme this, unexpectedly dark theme this semester, I think David did manage, nonetheless, and despite all of that, to inspire the students to show that holding on to the claims of law, even in the worst of times, is still a sign of hope, a sign of possibility. And I look forward to his comments now.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was most generous. I'll just make one correction, and that is you said it was my brilliant career as a student that got me my first academic job in South Africa. But actually getting a job in law faculty in South Africa was very easy at the time. South Africa was an affirmative action program for white men, and there were lots of jobs available. But thank you for those very kind words. Thank you also to the Tanner Committee, especially Jay Wallace, to the Chancellor, to the amazing Jane Fink, and most of all to Annabelle Brett and Melissa Lane, who together may have set, and I mean this seriously, my research agenda for the next while. Let me start by saying, and Chris talked about this, how sad I am not to be in the room with you. I've been excited about my participation in the Tanner lectures ever since I got the invitation, not just the event itself, but also meeting Professors Brett and Lane. I should explain, and Chris already did this in part, that the two lectures you've heard tonight and yesterday, in a real way, explain my absence. It was perfectly practicable for me to come, but it became increasingly impossible for me to be with you. I'd begun scrubbing my phone and email of messages that would get me into trouble at the border, but I'd begun to realize that I would have, as is now advised, to take a burner phone and leave my laptop behind. I thought that would in itself be suspicious because I was first going to Columbia Law to give a talk with the title, The War Against Law. So I became increasingly apprehensive about what might happen to me at the border. But just as concerning for me was the increasing sense of the moral impossibility of coming. I felt morally compromised by the process of deleting emails and messages, including hundreds of emails to do with a workshop I'm co-organizing in May, as well as WhatsApp group chats with friends and family. And I find the sense of moral impossibility both deeply interesting and most puzzling. I think it's standard advice now to academic visitors to China to take a burner phone and no laptop. And I don't think I'd feel morally compromised in the same way if I were contemplating such a visit. There seems, that is, to be a great deal of contingency in what's morally possible, because moral possibility depends not only on time and place, but also to a large extent on subjective position, as Professor Brett tells us at the end of lecture 1. Right, I think I've got it right now. So Professor Brett says that when a subject protests the impossibility of a law, they are not protesting that it's not practicable for them. They're saying it's not possible for them, that it drives them into a corner from which they can see no way out, or at least that it's too hard in the sense that it involves too great a sacrifice. And I'll try to say something more about this puzzle tomorrow, about the structure of what I think of as the moral corner, of which Professor Brett speaks. For the moment, note that the situation I was contemplating at the US border might seem very different from the situation Professor Brett contemplates in the lectures. That is, the situation of a person subject to a law which they could in fact obey, but they find it morally too compromising to do so. For as a non-citizen at the US border, I'm rightless, at the mercy of the discretion of a border control agent. I'm in what I call a prerogative space, a space of no law. Such a space is, and I'll suggest this tomorrow, akin to the situation of an enslaved person. And Professor Brett tells us that moral possibility is a condition of the law that governs a citizen, as opposed to the commands of a master over a slave. I think that's a very interesting observation. I also want to mention that I was somewhat daunted by the invitation. Professor Brett, as you know, is a leading scholar of late medieval and early modern and political thought. I'm a legal theorist and a public lawyer, for the most part firmly stuck in debates in philosophy of law in the 20th century. My focus is on problems that arise when the rule of law is under stress, an interest that began, as Chris told you, with my education in law and politics in apartheid South Africa. And actually, I thought that the observations tonight about Peru reminded me rather a lot about growing up in apartheid South Africa. And my only claim to competence in early modern thought comes from a long engagement with Thomas Hobbes's political and legal theory. But even that engagement is not historical, but presentist in a way that historians of thought often decry. For I've been primarily interested in the contribution I claim Hobbes can make to current debates, in particular to why we should take seriously a legal theorist who is for the most part marginalized by both political and legal philosophers, namely Lon Fuller. So I was hugely relieved when I started reading lecture 1 to find when I got to the second section the title, The Possibility Condition and the Modern Rule of Law, Lon Fuller's Version. For I've been convinced since I was a student trying to understand the apartheid legal order that Fuller's theory of the rule of law is the best on offer when one wants to explain the distinction that Professor Brett attributes to Aquinas, that the rule of law is more about the conditions of law, without which law is not properly law, than it is about what Aquinas had initially thought of as the qualities of law. And that sense of relief was reinforced when, towards the end of lecture 1, she explains that her conception of citizens' rights are primarily rights against the law. And she refers to Hobbes at this point. Yesterday, when Jay Wallace introduced Professor Brett, he read to us some striking lines, which I want to quote again, in part because there's an intriguing relationship between them and something Judith Sklar once said. And I was talking about Judith Sklar in the seminar that Chris mentioned this morning. My slides are still not cooperating. Let me see if that will do it. Oh, yeah, got it. Okay, so here is the quotation from Between History, Politics, and Law. What is distinctive to the history of political thought as a form of history is that the way in which it writes a borderline between past and present, as all history must, involves a second borderline between history and philosophy. The Janus face of history of political thought specifically is that the representation of a past way of thinking is at the same time an act of political thinking in the present. And Judith Sklar says in The Faces of Injustice, I do not know why a curious division of labor prevails, why philosophy ignores iniquity, while history and fiction deal with little else. Political theory, which lives in the territory between history and ethics, seems ideally suited to do something about this. And I think there's quite a lot of commonality between those two quotations. Now, our brief today is not lecture 1, but lecture 2, in which Professor Brett moves from setting up the problematic of the possibility condition to exploring the interface between law and politics that the problematic brings to light by thinking about possibility in terms of time. However, for me to make that same move, to comment on how the interface between law and politics unfolds in the dimension of time, I need to sketch a disagreement with Professor Brett about how best to understand Fuller, one which begins in lecture 1, but continues into lecture 2. And I should say that, and I think this is a virtue of the lectures, not a vice, that I find it quite difficult to disentangle the two lectures. But today I'm going to start with philosophy of law, and I hope this sketch will help to understand why Professor Brett, in drawing our attention to the possibility condition, has made a most important contribution to philosophy of law, understood as a branch of political philosophy in the sense of the philosophy of the modern legal state. Right, so we have already heard from Professor Brett about Lon Fuller and what she calls his celebrated discussion of the principles of legality. And we have these principles on this slide, running through from generality, promulgation, through to congruence between official action and declared rule. And Fuller claims in his book, The Morality of Law, that if we put all of this in place, we'll get something which he calls variously an inner morality of law, a bond of reciprocity. And he also says at a late point in the book that every departure from the principles of the law's inner morality is an affront to man's dignity as a responsible agent. Professor Brett, as I understand her, suggests that this account is rightly celebrated, but I think she supposes for the wrong reason. Fuller, in her view, is rare among 20th century legal theorists in his attention to the version of the possibility condition she sketches, that the law somehow fails as law if it makes it morally difficult or even if impossible for subjects to obey. And she finds that in the scholarship on Fuller, the language of possibility tends to disappear in translation because the language of power and possibility is frequently replaced by practicability. And I think she supposes that Fuller is partly responsible for this loss because he deliberately moves away from the kind of substantive natural law found in Aquinas to an understanding in which the inner morality of law is entirely procedural. For Aquinas, she says, the possibility condition mediates the demands of a substantive natural law through the essentially political requirements of governing a population. Fuller, in contrast, is too focused on the legislator's perspective because in his list of legislative failures, he distinguishes between the need for the legislator to avoid self-contradictory laws and the need to avoid laws that are beyond people's power to obey. That focus both excludes a key element of the early modern understanding of the possibility condition, what she calls evocatively the subject's eye viewpoint, and neglects the sociological perspective. Now, here's an extract from the passage on which Professor Brett bases his criticism of Fuller, where he says, from the standpoint of the lawmaker, there is an essential difference. Having difficulty with. From the standpoint of the lawmaker, there's an essential difference between the precautions he must take to keep his enactments consistent with one another and those he must take to be sure that the requirements of the law lie within the powers of those subject to them. Essential differences of this sort would be obscured by any attempt to telescope everything under the head of impossibility of obedience. However, a principal aim of Professor Brett's Lecture 1 is to draw attention to, as she puts it in Lecture 2, the fact that considerations of possibility open a gap between the laws legislated and the laws obeyed. And she suggests further that this gap, wider than Fuller conceived, is closed either through casuistry or, more relevantly for our concerns in these lectures, through politics. Her exploration of the interface between law and politics is through thinking about possibility in terms of time. And I want to suggest that Fuller has more to offer, not only on the subject's perspective, but also on how something like casuistry, which I take to be quite similar to the common law method, can help to close the gap between a law enacted at time 1, in compliance with the first 7 of the 8 principles of legality, and the application of the law at time 2 to a subject in compliance with the 8th principle of congruence. Moreover, I think the way that Fuller suggested it is appropriate to attempt to close the gap helps to make it morally possible for the subject to obey the law. But I don't want to suggest that Professor Brett's concern about Fuller is wrong-headed. For nowhere in the chapter on which she focuses the morality that makes law possible does Fuller explain how compliance with the desiderata that she calls procedural and others formal maintains the possibility condition by somehow ruling out substantively unjust laws. And here it's worth remarking on a tension in my comments between my claim earlier that Fuller is generally marginalized in philosophy of law and Professor Brett's claim that his account of the inner morality of law is celebrated. For the received view in philosophy of law and in much of political philosophy is that compliance with Fuller's desiderata does not impart any moral quality to law, but merely makes the law more effective in implementing whatever aims the powerful wish to achieve. As H.L.A. Hart, one of the foremost exponents of legal positivism, remarked, even if such desiderata are necessary features of law, compliance with them is unfortunately compatible with very great iniquity. And I think the explanation for this missing explanation in Fuller is twofold. The explanation of why, as Professor Brett puts it, he proceduralizes Aquinas' substantive natural law. Fuller did want to proceduralize substantive natural law, as found in the Catholic natural law tradition. At the very end of his book, he remarks that while Aquinas stands for many as a kind of symbol of all that is dogmatic and theological in the tradition of natural law, he in some measure recognized and dealt with all of the 8 principles of legality. But Fuller wished to extract the account of legality from Catholic theology to show how once extracted, that account can be put to work in explaining the authority of the modern legal state, a state which is secular in that there is more or less strict separation between itself and any church or religion. And that goal becomes clear in the last chapter of his book, The Substantive Aims of Law. There, Fuller talks about the neutrality of the neutrality of the law's internal morality towards substantive aims, and in a later section, the view of man implicit in legal morality. And he says that while legal morality can be said to be neutral over a wide range of ethical issues, it cannot be neutral in its view of man himself. He also claims that every departure from the principles of law's inner morality is an affront to man's dignity as a responsible agent. So there we have his first reason for proceduralization. And now let me get to the slide I had up a moment ago, which is his second reason for proceduralization. And that is, in extracting this account, Fuller wanted to show that the reaction of legal positivism to a natural law tradition that made law the instrument of Catholic theology was too extreme. For legal positivists supposed that the antidote to a legal theory that identified authentic law with compliance with the principles of one religion and understood state law as the instrument of the principles is to develop a value-neutral concept of law, in which law can have any content. And his fable of King Rex and Rex's failures to make law is intended to show that more has to be added to the positivist account as law as enacted or posited in accordance with the procedures accepted in a society as appropriate for making law. But if all that Fuller added, as Professor Brett seems to suggest, is more procedural principles, it is no surprise that, as she says, the language of possibility tends to disappear in translation because the language of power and possibility is frequently replaced by practicability. Fuller has two epigraphs to the chapter on which Professor Brett focuses, the morality that makes law possible, that help to explain how he thought that attempts to close the gap should be made. The first, which Professor Brett cites, deals with the possibility condition, and you have that towards the top of the slide. The second, I think, deals with the problem of the gap. So this is a quote from Lilburn, where Lilburn says, "It is desired that our learned lawyers would answer these ensuing queries, whether ever the Commonwealth, when they chose the Parliament, gave them a lawless, unlimited power, and at their pleasure to walk contrary to their own laws and ordinances before they have repealed them." And I think for Fuller, taking this quotation from Lilburn as his inspiration, the attempts to close what Professor Brett calls the gap are made over time through officials manifesting their fidelity to the rule of law by ensuring, as the eighth principle of legality directs, that's a principle of congruence, that there is congruence between official action and declared rule. And here I think we get the mediation that she talks about in regard to Aquinas. Fuller said of this principle that it was the most complex because both congruence could be destroyed or impaired in various ways, and because the procedural devices designed to maintain it take of necessity a variety of forms. And he said that the most subtle element in the task of maintaining congruence was interpretation. Legality, he claimed, requires that judges and other officials apply statutory law, not according to their fancy or with crabbed literalness, but in accordance with principles of interpretation that are appropriate to their position in the whole legal order. Issues submitted to the adjudicators, he said, tend to be converted into a claim of right or an accusation of guilt. This conversion is affected by the institutional framework within which both the litigant and the adjudicator function. Reasoned argument requires the person to present it as more than a naked demand, as a claim of right, that is, as supported by a principle. And I think what we see here emerging out of Fuller is a whole institutional perspective that was perhaps lacking to the people like Aquinas, and that allows for the mediation between the lawgiver and those on the receiving end of law that I think is important in closing the gap when it comes to the possibility condition. So here I think we can see emerging the subject's perspective. As Professor Lane put it yesterday, in also drawing attention to the importance of the congruence principle, what we see here is the citizens exercising agency on behalf of the laws, indeed exercising agency to enforce the laws. And what I have here, and I inflicted this slide on Chris Kutz's class earlier today, and I'll close with this slide because I've taken a lot of time, is my picture of Fuller's understanding of what I call the rule of law state. And what we have around the space of the rule of law state is a thick line, which is the line of legality. Everything that happens within the state has to be according to law. We have the sovereign or the ultimate lawmaker in a society who enacts law by abiding by the formal principles that Fuller sets out in that chapter. Those laws appear on something like a notice board in the town square. For those of you who know philosophy of law, this would amount to Hart's rule of recognition. People know what's law and what's not by seeing what appears on the notice board. But then that law has to be applied to the subjects. We have officials who apply the law, judges who interpret the law. They do so in accordance with procedural principles. And so we get this complex process of mediation from time one, when the sovereign enacts a law, to time two, when the law is finally applied to subjects. And it's through that complex dynamic that I think Fuller supposes that something like morality arises, perhaps moral possibility, and a bond of reciprocity is formed between sovereign and subject. And I think that does mark a distinct difference between Fuller and perhaps the medieval sorts on whom Professor Brett in part focuses. And I'll say more tomorrow, but I think that's the point at which I will close today. Thank you very much.
Professor Brett, would you like to say anything now, or should we move into Q&A? It's really up to you.
I'll just say one or two really brief things. Okay, so first let me thank David really warmly for these fantastic comments. It's such a privilege for me, who am not a scholar of the law and legal theory, to have this kind of engagement with what is very much my first encounter with this way of thinking. So I am really here to learn and entirely grateful. I think it's absolutely right, but this is a, I mean, I suppose I was trying to counterpoint Fuller and this early modern discussion, partly because this early modern condition can seem very alien, possibility as a condition of law. And I was really, I mean, I came to Fuller basically because I was interested in modern discussions of the sociology of law. But then when I read it, I thought, good heavens, possibility is really important to the way that he is setting this up. But it's not possibility in exactly the same way that my scholastics are thinking about it. So but I thought that he was, his historical sensibility, as I said in my first lecture, was astonishing. You know, I didn't realize that he had that kind of, and I need to understand a little bit more about where he's coming from on that. So, I mean, on the point of the contrast, I think it's absolutely wonderful what you say about, and this is a difference between the modern state and the times in which that there is this mediation between sovereign and subject through a kind of institutional context. And they are much more interested in that direct relationship between the sovereign and the subject. And I think that, so what's quite interesting about, I mean, just coming to today's lectures, is that someone like Matienzo, who is a lawyer, is quite interested in oh. Someone groaned really heavily outside. So is interested in law and the judicial and the judiciary as a form of legal activity that does not reduce to the sovereign's law. They might be using it very asymmetrically, but they are aware of that status. In the more sort of classic theoretical, it is much more about the relationship between citizen and sovereign, and the law is a precipitate of sovereignty. But I was struck on your final diagram that the reciprocity is between the crown and the citizens, and then the arrows go down to the judiciary, and then so there aren't really any direct arrows between the citizenry and the, or maybe I'm missing your point. So, I mean, the subject's eye viewpoint on the judiciary and on that sort of mediation and on the police who fall into that intermediary zone, I mean, those two could be seen as top-down and non-reciprocal relations. I don't have your diagram on the screen. But anyway, I absolutely take your point about that mediating point, and I really need to think a lot more about that. With Fuller, I mean, part of what I'm doing in these lectures, I mean, that there's a kind of, I think, a sort of cliche of what natural law thinking is. And if you look at the late scholastics, it doesn't really look like that at all. I actually think if you look at Aquinas, it doesn't really look like that at all. And the line between the substantive and the procedural is not what it might appear. I think I didn't want to suggest that Fuller was going entirely in the direction of the procedural. I think what I wanted to say about both his principle about non-contradiction and his particularly possibility, that's the one that I was focused on, is that they keep breaking the boundaries of the inner morality of law. These are spaces where it hits up against the external morality of it. So these seem to be conditions, both of them in Fuller, that can't be contained within the law, but do impact what's outside it. And so they seem to me to imply a substantive position, and as I said, a kind of thicker ethic. I'm not sure that if you go down the road of the possibility condition, law can be so neutral with regard to a variety of ethical positions, so long as they essentially respect this idea of the dignity or responsible agent. I mean, possibility to me implicates a subject of law that's thicker than that. I was reminded of Salah Ben Habib's notion of a situated self, which I think, and in that respect, a position that the subject of law is a responsible agent, a person with dignity, actually in itself can occlude or oppress subjectivity from the subject's eye viewpoint. So I guess that was my one reflection on that. But I will leave it there because I think I have a great deal more to think about, and I'm really grateful for your comments on that.
We'll have you sit here because you're still in the firing line.
Okay, great.
And so let's see. I think should I hand mics out or okay, Jane has the mic. Okay. So Annie Stolt. Here, Annie in the gray sweater, and then Johan, and then Jay.
Thanks. I guess I just wanted to invite you to say more about a kind of an intriguing comment that you made both early today and also I think a couple of times yesterday, which is that you see a kind of democratic promise in the idea of the possibility condition, sort of a popular responsiveness or accountability that kind of comes through with it. I can sort of see how one might think that way if one has an early modern sort of monarch or, non-democratic sovereign in one's mind. But I guess I'm wondering if you have a democratic legislature that's making the law, does permitting people to disobey laws that they find morally impossible actually promote democracy? I mean, one might expect that the democratic legislature is already going to take account of the subject side point of view to a significant degree. And I was thinking about your last example about the poor law in Spain. So imagine that a democratic legislature passes an anti-poverty initiative. Does permitting people to disobey because they are not civic-minded enough to pay the taxes, or that's not in keeping with the customs, does that promote democratic ends?
Great. Okay, so I do think this is a worry, and this is partly what motivated what I said in the first lecture, that I don't think we can go back to early modern casuistry, that this is not compatible with what we would think of as a democratic rule of law, right? If you just have people saying, well, the law ceases in my case because here's the general purpose of the law, but in my case, and therefore it ceases, and therefore I don't. So that's why I say, although that I'm interested in the construction of the subject of that, the way that it translates out into that kind of casuistry is something that I don't think is, which I do think is intention. But on the other hand, I don't think that, and here, I don't think that my consent to the, to my involvement in the democratic legislative process, because, like, for example, I voted for the government, or maybe I didn't vote for the government, but I'm kind of expected. I don't think that's enough to close this gap. I mean, the fact that I, as I said, the fact it might still be impossible for me. And so to me that remains because if essentially what you're then doing is you're simply absorbing the subject's eye viewpoint then into the sovereign's eye viewpoint, and you're saying, okay, well, at that point there is no gap because you got involved in it, and this is a kind of strong sort of, I take it, I'm not very good at Rousseau, but I take it that's the idea of his idea of what democracy is, but I'm not sure it's mine. So is it democratic or not? In a way, I think I think in a way it's not compatible with a certain construction of democratic sovereignty as the sovereignty of the people as embodied in this legislature. But it is a kind of, to me, well, perhaps democratic or popular subjecthood, which I think does depend on people being confident or enabled enough or active enough to not think that, not necessarily accept the law on the terms in which it is presented to them. So I think my answer to that lies in the construction of the subject and the subject. So there's a democratic construction of the subject that can be at odds, or at least not in sync with the ideology of a democracy in which the subjects are kind of involved in the sovereign. But I think maybe that captures our intuitions about democracy better than like a democracy of subjection as simultaneously existing with a democracy of sovereignty. Because unless, again, unless we go to an absolutely direct democracy, which we're, the people as the people is legislating the law the whole time, there is that gap. And most of the time you're just on the receiving end. I mean, my relation to the law in terms of consent is that I elect the government every 5 years, and I probably don't, the party that I vote for, either does or doesn't get in. And even if it does get in, as in the present case, it doesn't necessarily say what it's going to do, to do what it's going to say. So I really feel that this is pretty remote. My democratic sovereignty my participation in democratic sovereignty is quite remote. But I think that's the point that David is making about the institution, the fact that a modern state has this institutional apparatus, which is absolutely key to mediating that relationship. And I think that's a really important point that he made there and critical to thinking about possibility in a democracy.
It's on? Okay, great. So first, thank you for these two extremely stimulating and interesting lectures. I really enjoyed it. So my question is about the ratcheting up of the possibility condition in times of emergency, and in particular, whether the scholastic and early modern thinkers that you've been discussing in these two lectures recognized any upper limit on the demands that the state can make on its citizens in even the most dire of circumstances. So I want to illustrate the question with two brief moments from recent history. So the first took place during the Fukushima nuclear disaster that followed the 2010 earthquake in Japan, right? As many of us will remember, right, the tsunami knocked out the cooling systems of the reactor. The reactor was at risk of melting down. This would have caused an incalculable disaster. So initially, the Japanese government resorted to professional soldiers in managing the crisis. So, for example, they had, pilots of the Japanese army fly over the reactor, dropping water on the reactor to prevent it from overheating. And this did expose them to elevated doses of radiation, but it was deemed that this is a risk that is acceptable to require of a soldier in times of crisis. After all, they're someone who's signed up to, face unusual dangers in defense of the public. But then the situation deteriorated, and radiation levels began to spike to such a level that radiation poisoning was deemed, a very likely result of continuing to fight the crisis. And at that point, the Japanese government decided that this went beyond what could be asked even of enlisted professional soldiers. And so a call went out for volunteers, right, who would volunteer to heroically stay behind and kind of supererogatorily do what could no longer be required even of professional soldiers in this situation, the famous Fukushima 50. And it's them who eventually brought the situation under control. Second anecdote, very briefly, this happened during World War II, right? At one point during the war, the Royal Air Force was losing so many air crews over Germany to German anti-aircraft fire that a pilot's chances of making it through the 30 missions that they were required to fly, it was less than 1 in 4. And so some bureaucrat at Bomber Command came up with a scheme that might have reduced casualties. So he said, if we could, by lot, randomly select some of these pilots and send them on one-way suicide missions over Germany, well, they wouldn't need any fuel for the return trip, and they could carry so many more bombs that many fewer missions would have to be flown. And in this way, all pilots, likelihood of making it through the war would have gone up. However, those chosen by this scheme would have been sent to their certain death. And this scheme was rejected as morally not acceptable. And again, the thought was, we can expect, our soldiers to confront great and unusual danger, but there are limits. You cannot expect a soldier to go to his certain death. This was deemed, in the terminology of your lecture, not morally possible for most soldiers. It's supererogatory and a heroic sacrifice, but not something that could be expected. So my question is, did the early modern and scholastic thinkers that you were discussing make a similar distinction between, what is merely risky and onerous and can be expected in emergency circumstances, and then, the very highest sacrifice being expected to, go to uncertain death in defense of the Commonwealth? Or did they recognize no such distinction and there was no upper limit?
Thank you. Is this still? Yeah, it is still on. Yeah, thank you very much. Well, that is a question that they themselves sort of puzzle about. So it's axiomatic for these people. for these counter-reformation that it can't be supererogatory, right? Because anything that falls, the preservation of the Commonwealth is under natural law, and natural law does not demand supererogatory virtue. It could demand a very high level of it. And so I think that they do think that in the final analysis, exposure to certain death is something that the Commonwealth can command. So, for example, I mean, the classic situation of really tight is siege. So you might have to order up all citizens on the walls, and they would just have to face what was thrown at them. And I think the Commonwealth thinks that at the limit you can do that, but we really have to be right at the limit. And they're very worried, at least some of them are, worried about an attitude that gets to the limit too soon. And it's very interesting that they parallel this with military ethos. So they say the Commonwealth should not be prodigal of the blood of its citizens. I mean, if you have to spend it, you have to, but, you know, do you really have to? And I think they think that most of the time that you don't. And they think that the same thing applies to military commanders. They say the same thing. They should not throw their soldiers at dangers. And so the original formulation of the possibility condition, it's got this quite transparent relationship where a subject can understand, you know what, we are at that point. My life is actually necessary. And I think, but, so what's very interesting is that they're beginning to think increasingly in terms of risk rather than danger. And risk is less transparent, and this is a problem for modern democracies and for thinking about. And they're also aware that the technology of war is changing. So gunpowder changes, and so the use of explosive devices changes the sort of situation about necessary proximity, because you know, there could be risks. You know, because the spatial extent of it is just so. So I think it's very interesting to see them grapple with this question. And so there's a very influential Baroque scholar. So we're talking about the 1650s here. Juan de Caramuel, he's really well known for probabilism and laxism. That's far too, yeah, it's not what he is a probabilist, but there's a very, very sophisticated understanding of it. So he discusses plague, and he makes a distinction, and he thinks he's being original, and I think he is in explicitly theorizing this. There's a distinction between a law that designed to prevent bad things from happening, and a law that's designed to prevent the risk of bad things from happening. And so he thinks the laws containing contagion in times of plague are laws that are to do with risk. And he thinks that laws to do with risk do not cease in the particular case. That room for that casuistry of exception doesn't exist because the risk is generalized. And so this way of thinking in terms of risk actually changes the relationship and that transparency of the relationship between the subject and the state, on which the original formulation of the possibility condition applies. And I think that's a problem that we're sort of dealing with today. So then Caramuel then moves that over to military discipline, and he says, well, you know, sure, the general shouldn't be prodigal of the blood of his soldiers, but there's a question about security here, and for maintaining overall security, you can effectively do that. And he mentions watches, and he says there's a kind of watch or patrol in Spanish called Centinela Perdida, because it's lost. You're very unlikely not to come back. But he thinks that's okay because it's for the security of the whole. So, so I think these questions of security and the security state and states of security alter that relationship. It's very interesting to me that that in the two examples it was still articulated in terms of sacrifice. I think maybe what I would want to say there is that a language of sacrifice and the sense that this is a sacrifice from the subject's eye viewpoint, this is a real sacrifice, is inflecting the way in which they're thinking about. And I would think that that was an example of kind of reciprocity and them sort of calling for, well, you know, who is going to sign up for it? Because things are more possible for you if you've signed up for it than if you haven't. So yeah, that's a bit of a roundabout answer, but I think that they are worried about this, and we, as I say, we can kind of detect an evolution in their thought on that.
For one very brief question yeah.
Thank you, Professor Brett, for these very stimulating lectures. My question, and forgive me if it's overly broad, the lectures brought to mind the question for me of foundations, or what would ground possibility within a democratic context. It seems clear to me that within debates around theological doctrine of supererogation, how a possibility condition within the law would still be grounded in some way. But I was thinking about more recent democratic theorists who have talked about democracy as being somehow indeterminate, or characterized by some kind of void within. Anyway, this is something that some theorists have spoken about. So outside of a theological context, within a democratic context, what would ground or provide a foundation for a possibility of law in this sense? Would it just be a theory of freedom on some kind of democratic account, or something else? Thank you.
Okay, yes. So I'm not familiar with the theories that you're contrasting with, but yeah, I mean, this goes back to Professor Stiltz's question. And so, how are we going to think about democracy, and what is that? And I think that as it's clear, I am still. You know, there are many iterations of democracy in order, and there's a question that I'm not addressing in these lectures, and that I am still working on, about what iteration of democracy possibility thinking might fit into. And it depends what we think democracy is about. Is it, and what's the foundational value, if there is one? Because I quite agree with you. If you saw democracy, perhaps this is what you're hinting at, as, I mean, I think possibility, because at least the way that I'm constructing it, and with its importance of the subject's eye viewpoint, is going towards a thesis that this is not something, whatever's foundational cannot be objectively articulated in any particular way, and therefore it must be, I mean, maybe this is going towards a model of deliberative democracy where, you know, it must be, there must be articulated, and there must be a kind of forum for subjects to articulate that. I think that it's going to be very, very hard for them to agree, but I mean, I think all democratic theory understands that. So I think sorry, I'm now losing the thread of what I was saying. Freedom, interesting. I am still thinking about this. What is the relationship between possibility and freedom? And does it help to think of freedom in terms of possibility? I think my instinct is to say that yes, it does. And again, because I'm interested in this very textured and situated subject's eye viewpoint. I mean, freedom is great, presumably. But most people, I think moral possibility is closer to what most people are meaning by freedom in the concrete contours of their life, and as what I would call, yes, with Ben Habib, situated selves, than any kind of foundational concept of freedom that could be defined by, let's say, me as a theorist. So that sort of irreducible subjectivity of possibility and space for that sense of possibility to breathe and be articulated seems to me to fold into. I don't want to say that it replaced the language of freedom, because if you take the language of freedom out of democracy, what do you have? But I think it's a sense that's very close to an experience of freedom and what people would think that it would mean to be free. That you are not forced into the morally impossible or to the repugnant, that the conditions of your life allowed you to held that balance between your embeddedness in social norms and in your past and that opening to the future. Perfect freedom is not going to exist, but if we think about it as that kind of opening, that sort of poisedness, then. But I would say that it's not a thing that can be a foundational value, that it would have to be always a work in process and always, because we are always moving through time, and our relationship to that kind of temporal opening to the past and opening to the future is always moving. So yeah, I think this is probably anti-foundational in a modern iteration of it. Obviously, in these scholastics, there is a baseline natural law. But as I say, that baseline can be quite a way away. And this is what my worry about some caricatures of what natural law theory involves. It suggests that the moral baseline has to be really, really close. And it's really substantive. And, this is... but a lot of natural law theory historically doesn't operate like that at all. And so it's more amenable to thinking in modern terms than it's sometimes made out to be.
Very much. With that, let me thank Professor Brett, Professor Dyson-House. Let me thank all of you. I know there are still some questions left on the floor. Bring them back tomorrow. We'll pick them up and bring them back for tomorrow. Tomorrow we have our sort of seminar day of the Tanners. We'll have some more commentary by Professor Lane, Professor Dyson-House, some responses by Professor Brett, and quite a lot of time for Q&A. So see you tomorrow. Same place, same time.